everyone, welcome to the Changemaker 20 Summit. I hope all of you liked the video. So to begin with, I would like to introduce Dr. Nirupam Mehrotra. Dr. Nirupam Mehrotra is currently serving as Director, Bankers Institute of Rural Development, Lucknow. Dr. Nirupam has advanced degrees in economics from some of India's premier institutes. At BIRD, he is also overseeing the affairs of Center for Professional Cooperatives, which provides training in cooperative credit structure to ensure availability of professional staff with cooperatives for efficient delivery of banking and financial services. In a career spanning more than 20 years in NABARD, he has worked both in the areas of policy making and policy implementation. He contributed from NABARD to the expert group on agriculture indebtedness set up by GOAL, which was headed by Professor Radhakrishna, and to the recent internal working group to review agricultural credit setup by RBI, headed by the Deputy Governor, and has Professor Ashok Gulati as members. As part of the team in NABARD, he also extensively contributed to the task force on issues related to farmers' credit, headed by Sri Sarangi, which was set up by GOAL. His areas of expertise include agricultural credit, financial rural infrastructure projects, impact evaluation, research and advocacy. So over to you, sir. I would request you to address the audience on sustainable agriculture and livelihood.
Thank you, Madam
Over to
Swami.
Dr. Nirupam Mehrotra.
And at the outset, I would like to thank the Connecting Dreams Foundation and other organizers of the Changemaker 20 Summit for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views on this important and vital subject that confronts all of us. In fact, I'm really humbled to be sharing the dais with some of the illustrious thinkers, policymakers, implementers who have come to this most important Changemaker 20 Summit. At the same time, I would like to congratulate Connecting Dreams Foundation and its key partners for organizing such an important summit, which is delving on so many thematic areas where the focus is needed today, like climate change, skill development, women empowerment, food security, poverty alleviation, and many such themes which are very, very important. At the same time, I think somewhere many of the themes are interlinked also. So I am sure today I have got an opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the subject sustainable agriculture and food security. What comes to my mind initially is that the question becomes that is there a trade-off between these two terms, sustainable agriculture and food security? Are they antitheses of one another? When we say it in one sentence, I think this issue in the literature and otherwise also, I think, should not be a cause of concern because it is long settled in terms of that. And as I go ahead and as I share my views, some of these concerns which are there and maybe must be raising some doubts in some minds should also be taken care of. What I propose to do is just to share some of the issues, but before that I would like to also share that although you have sort of mentioned it, is that presently I am heading the NABARD's learning institution, Bankers Institute of Rural Development, and I had a career spanning in NABARD for almost 20 more years now. And as you know, NABARD is the development financial institution and in spearheading development finance, and it was set up in 1982 by an act of the parliament, and it has a balance sheet size of around almost close to 80 billion INR or 8 lakh crore. And in some ways, NABARD has been innovatively involved in this area and livelihoods since its beginning. And I think one of the pioneering livelihood interventions which are not only known in India but in the world over is, I'm sure all the participants must have heard about the SHG bank linkage program, or the world's now largest microfinance program. So just to give it as a aside, the NABARD has been all along been innovating with this and many other areas which I will sort of delve in as I go along. Now the question is that as per the FPO, in terms of food security, when we speak, we need to get some numbers in place. So around 800 million there are undernourished and around 1 billion malnourished population in the world. And the FAO also mentions in one of its reports that almost 1/3 of the food that gets produced goes waste. So on the one hand, we have malnourishment, undernourishment, and then we have food shortages also. At the same time, there is food wastage also. So there are in many ways, these are very contradictory to one another. One is an irony of the other, but these are the issues at the when we see the macro numbers. I was reading a report of the FAO, and it said that almost it's not only about undernourishment. I think almost 1/3 of the world's total population is also micro deficient, and to that extent, I think when we deep dive into this issue, all these things are intricately linked to our food systems and how the food system, the present consumption patterns, and also the angle of food security. They need to be sort of delved at the micro level. But these are some of the macro numbers that I wanted to put in front of you. And more importantly, 98% of this world's total population, which is malnourished, are not in the higher income countries. So that is another figure. So we sort of in sharing these numbers, what I am trying to hint at or lead you to is the fact that there is a diagnosis or a localization of where the effort should be, and where the effort should be in terms of the global map. If we see, then we will be able to sort of recognize better, devise plans according to the need that is required. There is nothing like a sort of one uniform solution to this issue at all. And what was sustainable maybe few years back is not sustainable today. When we go ahead, I will like to take the example of green revolution. Now, and I'll be coming back to that in a moment. So, is there any problem in terms of food security or food production? I think FAO, some of the studies and estimates that it has mentioned is that around 2050, the population of the world will cross 9 billion. And there will be a requirement of almost 50 to 60% increase in food production. Now, whether this increase in food production with the current level of technology and the type of technology and the type of consumption pattern will it be achieved is something which I would like to place in front of you to sort of have a to dive deep into it, these questions. But the good news is that there are already solutions on the anvil which will help us answer this question, which will arise in the future. So just to get some of the basics in place, when we speak of food security, we basically essentially are speaking of 4 things. One is that there has to be a physical access to food. We all know, and which is captured by the food grain production, cereal production, including meat and allied activities, horticulture. So food product, physical production. Then there is an economic angle to it. Just by having the food does not mean that it will be available to all. You should have the purchasing power to buy food. So that is the second aspect of food security. And the third aspect, which is actually in the last decade or so has amplified, and thanks to researchers and is that the utilization aspect. It is not only about production and economic, it is also about the utilization of that food in terms of nutrition. So is the intake nutrient enough? We were talking, because these are some of the numbers which are coming, that there is micronutrient also deficit is there. So whether that utilization in terms of food which is basically nutritious is the question. And last but not the least, I think is even more important now in the present context as I speak to you, is the stability aspect of food. Maybe we may be having a food secure, if some person, if we take, is food secure till last year. Suppose there is a flood, some event, and increasingly climate change is sort of coming up in a newer dimension, that it really plays havoc in terms of stability. So suddenly you find that your livelihood goes up. And then there are tracks. We all are aware of what's happening in the Himalayas. At least yesterday also they were disturbing pictures from some of the Himalayan states in India of how there are landslides and there are sort of floodings in some part. So whole livelihood issue also gets, and so where is the question of stability there? So our food, so this is an important question, and as we go along, we have to have a sort of a manner in which we can sort of answer these questions, build the resilience that is required. So that was food security. Now, what is sustainable agriculture? I am sure that there are experts and pundits and FAO reports, other reports, which have given a very precise definition. But for me, personally, I think I would say if sustainable agriculture has to be contextual in terms of the needs that it is there, in terms of the local this thing. And basically, it essentially means that you will have to balance basically your current consumption needs, your current requirements, and the future requirements, the future intergenerational requirements. We should not be sort of exploiting the future generations' claim on the food and the environment and those systems. For me, that is what is sustainable agriculture. And sustainable so now I have sort of dealt with food, sustainable agriculture in terms of food security, and also in some manners also hinted I come back to the question that what was sustainable, say, previously may not be needs a newer definition, a newer requirement as emerged. Just to take one example, India was not food secure till 1965, 1968, when we had to import food. And then there came Green Revolution technology. We all are aware the Green Revolution technology made India food secure also in terms of physical production. We became self-sufficient today, in fact, but that technology at that point of time served a purpose. It served a purpose to make India food secure so very important that perhaps the generation that I grew up didn't have to think about where the next meal will come from in terms of the production. But the generation before me, and I would like to impress this point, that many of the change makers in this are participants who should also realize that there were times not too much in distant past when you didn't have one plate full of food. Our own families of the previous generation were sort of about for it. But that technology led to certain effects which became later on visible, that it had its impact on the soil, it had its impact on the water we drink, because it was chemical intensive. It led to some soil degradation. Maybe too much of intensive use was taken. Maybe there were limits to that technology that could have gone. And we are having in parts of this country where we are also talking about diversification of agriculture. And to take an example, a real life example, when we have a sort of a wheat rice cycle, To produce a kilo of wheat, these estimates are not of mine, but they are very much in the public domain. In India, to produce 1 kg of wheat requires anything between 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water. For wheat, I think it is little less, and for some other crops also this. But why I have taken rice? Rice is a staple food in many, but if you have to produce, and rice till recently, if we leave out basmati rice, India was not only one of the major producers of rice, was one of the major exporters of rice. So basically, when we produce 1 kg and export, we are actually exporting water, which is a scarce resource. Does it come easy? Is rice growing in water abundant areas? Is the question that we need to ask. Or it has been artificially made. Now a lot of experts are now sort of, and rightly so, questioning the sustainability aspect of agriculture in terms of a crop rotation system of wheat and rice, and they want to introduce a sort of a different crop rotation which is much more suitable for that. Now, the reason I took this example is that just to drive home the point that the new kid on the block, it's not only a kid, because now the United Nations has told it's no more only about climate change, or rather global warming. The United Nations, I think one of the reports recently which came out, it says that it is global boiling, not warming. And I think the trigger for using that word was because of the heat waves that Europe was facing. So, and it has its own impact. So the point that I am trying to make is that we need to be, when we talk of sustainable agriculture in terms of today's ecosystem and the environment, we need to incorporate climate change very much in it. And that is something that I think is in some ways very complicated, but at the other level, it is also quite simple if we demystify to try to understand how do we incorporate the climate change elephant in terms of our own ecosystem. How do we make it relevant in terms of projects that we carry out? And these are some of the things that I would like to share NABARD's experience in doing so. Although NABARD has been doing it when climate change, the term as we used now was not that prevalent. So, but the intent of that we had already incorporated in our policy way back. So before I do so, just to buttress the point that 2021, why I am harping this again and again, that 2021 actually was one of the warmest year in India since 1901 during the last decade. Since 1901, 2021, the figures say it was one of the warmest year in the last decade. And 11 out of the 15 warmest years that the country has seen on record happened during the period 2007 and 2021. 11 out of the 15 warmest. So one sort of doesn't have to go. This is the empirical evidence, because, and as we know that when the average temperature rises, it has an effect on various crops in various fashions and the production, and in terms of flooding events, the frequency in which it happens, and all that. So now, increasingly, agriculture is going to be affected, both in terms of, because agriculture, I think the greenhouse effects from agriculture, I think around 13.5% of the greenhouse emissions are globally agriculture accounts for directly, and another 17% indirectly because of deforestation and other such land use changes effect. Why this is important is that this factor needs to be taken care of, and how we can do so is something which is important. And how we can do so, I think there is a concept, and again I would caution that this is a concept which is saying that it is climate smart agriculture. We need to practice climate smart agriculture. But climate smart agriculture in one part of India will be very different. It will be really climate unsmart if it is not localized. But there are a few tenets. There is a method through which we can sort of decipher it. The climate smart agriculture basically means that it has to, there are 3 or 4 things. It should increase productivity. It should enhance resilience through adaptation. And it should reduce or remove greenhouse emissions. And if possible, while doing so, also the question of sustainable livelihoods also is important. And at the same time, it should be in alignment with the achievement of the national food security and developmental goals. So as a framework, it provides us a sort of nuts and bolts to basically what I would term as that it marries sustainable agriculture and food security, the topic that we are discussing today. So climate smart agriculture is the method through which both can. As far as NABARD is concerned, around in the climate change space across, we have around more than 40 projects which we have incorporated, or rather have been at various stages of implementation. Some of 2 or 3 of them are from the GCF, the Global Climate Fund. The others are the National Adaptation Fund, the AFP Fund. If somebody wants to know more about this, around 2,000 crore this portfolio is there only under this climate change on these 40 projects only. I would request them to go to the latest NABARD annual report. There is a full-fledged chapter on that, and you can get details of that. The only point that I want to make is that these are not only the 40 projects. NABARD also, as I was saying, when the climate change was not there, when I come to the question of livelihood, innovated with 2 different kinds of funds with 2 different interventions. And both of them are relevant from the climate change perspective. One was the Watershed Development Fund. Watershed as a concept is mostly known to most. So we have basically sort of NABARD through the watershed mechanism was able to sort of bring about 27 lakh hectares since 2000, and around 3,600 watershed projects were there, which has held check burns and sort of made those areas more green. But what was the learning from that is that there is a critical gap that happened. While sustainable livelihoods sort of got formed, but to sustain it in a very sustainable manner year after year, there was a critical gap that finance or agri credit or rural credit absorption capacity, usually you want that in watershed areas should increase. It did increase, but I think it did increase in the proportion in which it was envisaged. So now, to that extent, the benefits could not be sort of amplified, and at the same time could not be sustained on a longer basis. So that is one learning that we got from those projects, that there were cases where we should have innovated in terms of credit. We thought credit will flow on its own because the credit absorption capacity anyway gets sort of enhanced in watershed areas. So that was one, I would say, is one of the learnings from that, but it gave us fantastic output in terms of how to use local communities, local resources, participatory method. The second one was, I would say, a typical agricultural based livelihood scheme which was targeted at the tribal areas and tribal families, which is basically essentially you have in India we use the word acre and biga, and so it was a orchard development of 1 acre, which essentially means around 4,000 square meters of you try to plant in sort of soil conditions which are not conducive for regular cereal crops, orchards of mango, guava, lemon, and sort of do it in an orchard fashion with that spacing. Depending if you are doing it in Gujarat, you will have the variety which is relevant to Gujarat. If you are doing it in Madhya Pradesh, you can have the mango variety which is relevant to that. And there was a sort of a well scientific method to do that, and on an average around 500 tribal families were sort of given that as a grant based this thing, and the project rolled out. The project gave, to be very fair in terms of there are independent evaluation of that project, is that it really made a difference in parts of Gujarat like Valsad, in parts of Madhya Pradesh, in many other places. The 1 acre wadi model became very successful for tribal families. It had two objectives. It was able to sort of measure up to both the objectives. The first objective was that these tribal families, it was seen that they wanted something of a sustainable kind of livelihood that could give them regular incomes. So after 2 or 3 years, there were a flow of regular income stream, number one. Number two, these tribal families used to migrate to urban areas. So the migration, I would say, it completely stopped, but it reduced. The frequency and the total time taken also spent outside for migration also reduced. This is well documented. So this, and how many tribal families one could reach with these projects? Around 27 billion INR, 6 lakh families and 5.7 lakh acre was the total. The numbers are important, but more than the numbers, the learnings are important. In both these projects, in both these interventions, I would say, there were two learnings. The first learning is that over the years, NABARD could innovate, and localized nature-based interventions have low risk and produce sustainable results. And of course, something which is very obvious, but nevertheless, it is difficult to achieve, but it does make a huge difference, is that co-owning a project with beneficiary leads to better execution and monitoring along with lowering costs. Obviously, if there is participation, co-owning the project, co-owning is, by the way, not very easy. It has to run its own sort of time. You have to work with the community at a very close quarters, and it's not easy, I would say, in any project. But for that matter, in working with tribal families, it was even little more difficult. But innovation came not only of the acre in which the orchards were there. Over a period of time, there were new demands on the 1 acre plot. Like there was infusion of drip technology, sprinkler technology, other such interventions. There were health related issues which were coming up in those communities. So the project frame gave so much of flexibility that midway one could sort of incorporate those elements which actually became very, very important in the success of the project. The point is that the same type of intervention as a tribal development project or the Wadi orchard, if you go to Madhya Pradesh in certain regions, and if you go to Gujarat in the Valsad area, you will find that in the project design itself there were so many changes in the two states, but the implementing agency in terms of the NGO and in terms of the of NABARD was the same. So contextualized it to the local condition. I think it is easier said than done. but this flexibility has to be there, and that was the learning. And this is what gives the ray of hope in terms of uh, climate smart agriculture, in terms of food security, and in terms of sustainable agriculture, that you will have to contextualize it into terms of the local situation. I will take another 5 minutes and maybe little more. That till now I gave sort of then a broad idea about what was lacking, then gave the concept and highlighted two interventions of NABARD, which we think we are quite proud of and which really showed a lot of good results in terms of generating sustainable livelihoods in the agricultural space. NABARD does it in the non-agricultural space also. Those interventions I have not brought because I wanted to focus only on agriculture and land-based thing. Not that the others are not important. One of the things I think now, the gap which I see is that in terms of the global framework of climate change and climate finance in particular, is that climate finance as a at the global level, there are now estimates that you require $3 trillion. One is available. Some will come from public finance. Some will come from the private sector. At the macro level, those estimates are good, fine, and those are important. But the major gap, according to me, is that even if that money comes through, and where it should come through in the developing nations like India, where actually the problem is more acute, because perils that you have to use with technologies that sometimes it just fails you, but it also has its learning that yes, we need to keep working with it so that to make it function. So as I was saying, so I think in all this, one of the things that is important from a perspective of the micro in terms of the projects, that how at the macro level, if we even sort of get the climate finance equation right in terms of developing versus developed, and I think it will all. There are two aspects which I would focus. That we need to move climate finance to climate adaptation more than climate mitigation in terms of the construct. That's something which is, because adaptation is very intricately linked also, not that mitigation is not, but climate finance, adaptation finance is actually flowing very less. Number one. Number two is that how do we make sure that the pipeline is there, that the current existing institutions, most of the rural credit in this country goes through the rural branches of commercial, cooperative and regional rural. I'm talking about India in specific architectures. The agri credit flows through. And we also know that if there has to be a huge climate action thing happening, it has to be in the rural areas of this country. We also know that 75% of the world's poor are actually stay in the rural areas. So most of the poverty is also concentrated in the rural. Action needs to be in the rural areas in terms of even climate finance, in terms of income, climate smart agriculture. And so presently we were doing some work and some consultations, and our feedback from the field that we work with is that there are a lot of innovative technologies that are available at the ground and which are at the pilot stage, but we need scaling up. That scaling up alone cannot happen with a grant-based system. It has to, they are actually sustainable in terms of a blended capital between loan plus grant, and it is wanting a channel through which you flow it. So that channel, the existing channel of commercial, cooperative and commercial banks and RRBs, it has to flow down through the same system. Today the agricultural credit in this country is around 20 lakh crore. That's the thing. How do you do it? What are the banks in a position? That is where capacity building comes in, and institutions like BIRD come in. More importantly, there is another factor through which this will flow in. Is I will stop by saying this, that it has to be the some collectives, the FPO give us a ray of hope, or maybe that may be the right medium to actually tackle climate change through this pipeline, through which you can also bring in the banking system into it. Sustainable agriculture and food security, when I started, I said that there are two aspects. One is the physical and one other is the economic. Other two also were there. Increasingly, we are talking about a fragmented system in which the average size of land holding in India is 1.08. In that 1.08 hectares, in terms of the consumption requirement, and in terms of increasingly the farmer is interacting with the market. So we need to, not only production is important, it is the income which is also important. So to the part of the equation, there is production into price is equal to what he will or she will get in terms of income. How do you enhance the incomes? How do you make the markets essentially work for the smallholder agriculture? This is the question that needs to be asked in the context of India, and that is in the context. This context is very different in terms of the climate risk that one is sort of talking about in the developed nations. There, this problem is not there. They don't have the problem of smallholder agriculture. In many of these countries, only 1 or 2% of the population is dependent. Here, almost 40% directly, 45% are directly dependent on agriculture with an average size of 40. So, why this is important? Is also because, see, the recent, if you see the fluctuations in some of the commodities, I would not like to sort of name them. Everybody knows that. In terms of diversity, if we want to diversify from a rice wheat system, then bring in diversification, bring in more vegetables and all that. Yes, we have to bring in so that it leads to consumption. But at the same time, the new challenge that is there is that, do we have the markets that will function best for the smallholder agriculture? If the price rises of some commodities, it is very important. Not only the consumer is sort of taken care of, but the farmer who produces it should be also taken care of. So that price increase should also flow to the farmer. His or her share should increase. For that to happen, I think the markets needs to be also nudged in such a fashion. This is a policy point, I think, but it needs to be sort of taken note of. So that is another thing. Then I think I have almost taken a lot of time. I would like to only sort of leave you with the last bit, and I will be open to taking any questions. Is that diversification has to be done smart. Now I will leave with only two figures. Is that one is rice, as I said, takes 3,000 to 5,000 liters of per kg. And if I take millets, it only takes 600 to 800. In fact, it is a climate resilient crop. But millets also takes 600 to 800. So it has the diversification to take place in terms of millets. Do our food systems have to accordingly change for that type of a diversification? It is easier said than done. But at the same time, I think it will be, if this happens, this will be much more climate resilient, climate smart, and it will be much more nutritious. So there is no paradox between sustainable agriculture and food security. That is what I would like to end with. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Touched upon all the points, and you were able to address a lot of things. I had a question. I wanted to ask a question, but towards the end, you talked about FPOs also. So I would just like to mention that I have been through Bird's website, and I have read a lot of modules, both in English and Hindi, that talks about FPO, how work has to be done. I think I would just want to share that Bird is creating excellent curriculum for the training of these FPOs, which is a relatively new concept, and a lot of people are not aware. You touched upon FPO concept. If you could throw a little more light on how FPO is set up and what is the role of an FPO.
Actually, Bird has done some pioneering work in the field of farmer producer organizations, and NABARD has been forming FPOs since 2012-13. The idea is very simple, that with a landholding size of average landholding size of 1.08 hectares, how do you make collectives that work? So FPOs are basically producers organization which are registered into various acts, but the idea is to register it under a Companies Act. And the government of India also has a scheme now, which is called the 10,000 FPO scheme, in which detailed guidelines are there. There are agencies which are called the CBPOs or the NGOs or implementing agencies who form the FPOs, and there are laid down milestones according to which within a 5-year period these FPOs can become self-sustaining and sustainable. They will have a board, they will have a CEO, they will have compliances just like any other company that has to be run. So that is what it is there, and we run modules for the various this thing. Idea is very simple at the end. Ultimately, when I was telling you, or rather the participants, that see, the markets have to work for the smallholder. FPO is a medium in which the markets can work for the smallholders both on the production end as well as on the marketing end, because there is a collective bargaining power. And in the market, as we all know, ideally there should not be any concentration of market power, but bargaining happens in a market construct. So FPOs become a sort of a collective on which the bargaining can happen, and the market can function well for all. That is my take on the FPOs.
So since this topic is something that I really study about, I've been reading about CBPOs, FPOs, I've been through your modules also. So a practical, a real life situation I wanted to understand. So recently, like we all know, Gujarat faced a lot of cyclone challenges. There was a cyclone in Gujarat. So there is this FPO I have volunteered with, and they have done a lot of work. They did a lot of farming in Kutch region. So now the entire plantation, the farms have been destroyed. So is there anything? So does FPO have any role in supporting these farmers that face the brunt of natural calamities, or it is the role of the government only, or FPOs also have a role to play here, because now the farms are completely destroyed due to the cyclone? So do FPOs have any role to play here?
Yes, sir. FPOs are basically essentially nothing but farmers' collectives. So they come together and do it. So basically, this is where the gap of policy is there, and implementing agencies need to be cognizant of that. There are insurance instruments which one should have hedged for. Whether it was there or not, one has to look at, number one. Number two, the capacity as a collective to absorb the risk is much more than an individual farmer. So whether at what stage this FPO is, there are certain, the guidelines provide for some support, but not to the extent, I think, of a catastrophe risk to take care of. But for want of the fact it is a very specific question about a specific FPO, this is, I would like to know little more details, and maybe offline I can sort of put you across to the relevant agencies.
Yes.
Nice. I once again thank Connecting Dreams Foundation and the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the subject, and I hope it would have been nice and in terms of fruitful discussion that took place in this forum. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely, sir. A pleasure indeed. Thank you so much for connecting.
Thanks.
Thank you.